So sometimes, if I'm being completely honest, I have to admit that I almost can't help seeing kind of the brokenness around me. Even when there's beauty, it's like my eyes are drawn to the problems, the flaw, the one bad thing. And that's what I focus on. And I don't know how many of you share this with me, but sometimes I'll find myself in a situation that I'm supposed to enjoy, that's great and wonderful, but I'll find myself down and moody and less than enthused because I managed to find that one wrong thing, you know? Hey, Pete, you won the lottery. Yay, great. I probably got to pay taxes. What's wrong with me, right? Some people call it being a glass half empty person or a pessimist. Anybody relate to that? Or worse, are you married to someone that can relate to that? But even for those of you who aren't always, the problem seers, I still think it's true of everyone that more often than not, how we feel in or about a given situation is often determined on how we look at or focus on things, how we choose to see the good or the bad. I remember my wife and I first came out here to San Diego and we were looking for a place to live. And one of the oddest things that I experienced having come from the Midwest was the way that houses could look so radically different in the same part of town. Because where we grew up, sure, every town had the haves and the have-nots, and the nicer side of town, the bigger, more expensive homes over here. And then on the other side of the railroad tracks, you had things maybe a little more run down, people didn't have as much. But those areas were always separated. They were apart from each other. Here, you could look this way and see an old pickup truck on cinder blocks converted into a multifamily home. And then on the other side of the fence, a 6-bedroom villa that I could never afford, right? We have brand new upscale developments built next to ostrich farms out here. It's kind of weird. It was hard to get used to. So we found ourselves struggling to answer what had always been a fairly simple and straightforward question in this new place to live. Is this a good neighborhood? How do you even answer that? Well, many times you have to admit that it's simply a matter of perspective. It depends which house you choose to look at. And please know that I'm not trying to minimize or criticize those who have to afford cheaper housing. I get it, this place is crazy expensive. All land in San Diego is valuable, so you build the best house you can wherever you can. And we're all struggling to afford and strive in this place. It can be tough and difficult, but just me saying that out loud, I know probably some of my friends watching this back in the Midwest are saying, shut your mouth, you live in paradise. You have the ocean, right? And that's true, it's just a matter of perspective, isn't it? The truth is you can find broken windows anywhere if you choose to look for them. And vice versa, you can find beauty and hope even in the lowliest places if you choose to look for it. I mean, just think about where I'm standing right now. If you look at my view, there's plenty to complain about, right? Who would ever want to live here? But I can turn this way and suddenly I'm reminded that I live in paradise. Who would ever leave this place? And I don't know about you, but the last month has been a kind of up and down roller coaster of emotions and feelings that are often completely based upon my perspective at the time. I'll go from thinking everything's fine, enjoying life, I'll read one news article full of doom and gloom and somehow I got a bad, the world is terrible. And then I'll feel terrible and horrible, and a moment later I'm sitting with my kids and realizing that there's good here. Over these past few weeks, we've been talking about the idea of thriving, not just surviving during this difficult time of social distancing. A time when things aren't great, there's a lot of suffering, fear, and uncertainty. How could we possibly expect to do more than just survive? And I wonder if the answer isn't kind of somewhere in these broken down houses, that one of the most important keys to thriving rather than surviving is not how much money you have or how big your house is or whether you have enough toilet paper. The difference is all about perspective. It's about what you choose to focus on. So we've been looking at people in the Bible who faced similar challenges of social distancing and how they thrived in it. We saw Joseph thrive through an unjust prison sentence by allowing God to handle what he couldn't and choosing to trust God to control the outcome, which he did. Then last week, Brandon talked about how David used the time alone in the fields by himself, bored and neglected, to allow God to connect the dots and prepare him for great things. And today I want to talk about another person who had a choice to make when faced with such a difficulty, the Apostle Paul, a man who wrote a great deal of our New Testament, but who was all too familiar with being a prisoner, even in his own home. And we read about Paul's story in the second half of the book of Acts. Although not one of the original followers of Jesus and actually opposing and persecuting the first Christians, Paul would eventually encounter Jesus and become a devoted follower, dedicating the rest of his life to spreading the gospel of Jesus to the world. But this would not be an easy path by any stretch of the imagination. Everywhere he went, he faced trouble, persecution, physical abuse, riots, and yes, even prison. Our first picture of this is in Acts 16, where Paul and his friend Silas are beaten and thrown in jail with their feet manacled in chains. And in a moment where it would seem Paul would be the most scared, upset, angry with God for allowing such a terrible thing to happen, we're told he actually held a much different perspective. It says this in chapter 16, verse 25. It says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Now look, I don't think they were sulking against the prison bars, singing, swing low, sweet chair, like there's some deep, dark depression. They were praising God. Their perspective was in how great he was and how worthy he was of their praise despite the chains. And the outcome was awesome. God sent an earthquake, flew open the prison doors. The jailer becomes a follower of Jesus. The next day they release him from prison. It's like, wow. But as cool as that miraculous rescue was, that wouldn't always be the case for Paul. Later, as Paul is traveling back to Jerusalem before he wants to go on to Spain and Europe, everyone knows there could be trouble with the Jewish people who feel he's teaching heresy. And then it's full on confirmed by a prophet who comes to Paul and tells him what will happen if he continues on. In Acts 21, verse 11, we read, it says this, a prophet came and said, coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it and said, the Holy Spirit says, in this way, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles. He's basically telling Paul that if you continue on this journey, if you keep going to Jerusalem preaching the gospel, you're going to wind up in prison. And so his friends actually plead with him not to go. Like, don't do this. But Paul says, why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready to die if need be, much less prison. Prison doesn't scare him. Death doesn't even deter him. Why not? Well, Paul continues on, and sure enough, he's arrested, beaten, almost killed, and put on trial. And you can go ahead and read the rest of the story yourself in the book of Acts. But from that point on, Paul will spend the rest of his life as a prisoner, including under house arrest in the city of Rome. There'd be no miraculous deliverance, no earthquake freeing him from captivity. And while the Bible doesn't recount his end, tradition is that Paul likely died while still imprisoned. He spent the rest of his life in chains for the gospel. Wow, great story, Pete. Thanks for cheering us up. Oh, hold on, though. You see, the book of Acts doesn't tell us any more of Paul's stories. But that doesn't mean we'd hear the last from him, quite the contrary. Because it was in prison that Paul would begin writing letters to the churches, letters that would go on to form much of what we today call our New Testament. How's that for God connecting the dots, right, that we saw last week? It might have looked like he was rotting away in prison, like Satan had won the battle, and here goes Paul writing some of the most important letters ever written in the history of humankind. No big deal. But these were letters that would also give us some fascinating insight into Paul's perspective while living as a prisoner, cut off from the world, without his freedom. So maybe we should look and see what he said, given what we're going to go through ourselves during the season of social distancing. And the best letter to focus on is one we know specifically he wrote from prison, his letter to the church in Philippi called Philippians. He actually says in this letter that he is in chains for Christ, so we know he's in prison. But it's the way he describes it that's so important. It's how he chooses to see his time in prison that's so cool. He says this in Philippians 1, verse 12. He says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear to everyone that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. He's not rotting away in a cell, having a pity party, angry at God for not sending another earthquake and getting him out of there. He's not losing it over how difficult it is to be in prison and not having his freedom. He's not even complaining about not having enough toilet paper. And trust me, he didn't have any. Rather, his perspective was that his time in prison was accomplishing something great. People were getting saved, and other Christians were becoming bolder and more confident in sharing their faith. Paul was choosing to look at the great things God was doing rather than the hardship. He was choosing to look out at something beautiful rather than what was maybe broken around him. He was looking at his chains and saying to himself and others, sure, this isn't ideal. I'd rather not be in prison. But each one of these small little iron links is an individual reminder of what God is doing in and through my life right now. You look and see me in chains, but I choose to see chains being broken in the lives of those around me. And what I want to make sure you don't miss here is what I just said, because it's important. Paul chose to look at that good. I think most of you can probably easily agree that we're all affected by what we focus on. But what we often miss, don't take into account, is that it's a choice. How do I know? Paul will actually go on to tell us. In chapter 4, he says this, right at the beginning of verse 4, he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice." Now hold on a second. I don't know about you, but that's a hard one for me personally. How can you tell someone to rejoice? Joy it's an emotion. You can't just up and decide I want to feel a certain way. You can't just turn it on and off like a switch. So what is he saying? Are we supposed to fake it till we make it? Should I just pretend I'm happy even when I'm not, hoping it'll make me feel better? If I'm just forcing myself to be joyful, that's not real joy, right? So is Paul just acting joyful while in prison, putting on a good front so the other people would like Jesus or something? No. Look what he goes on to say in verse 8. He says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." He's telling us to choose what we think about. And it's so vital, guys, that we understand this point. Paul is saying, he's telling us that perspective is a choice. You choose what you focus on. You decide what you will dwell on. It's up to you whether or not you focus on the things that are good, noble, pure, and lovely. The things that God is doing in this season, the blessings he has for you in these moments, on what he might be doing through you for others, or you can sit there and focus on the terrible, the broken, the bad. Oh, it's so everything's just bad. It's up to you. And whether or not you thrive in this season will lead directly out of what you choose to focus on. And I love how just a few verses later, after thanking some of the people who brought him food and supplies in prison, because the prisons didn't feed you back then, without someone else's help you would starve, he would give one of those refrigerator verses. You know the super famous ones everyone likes to quote? He would say this in chapter 4. He would say, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want, I can do all things through him who gives me strength." You see, guys, Paul believed in finding the good in a situation, of choosing to look at that which was worthy of being thankful for and grateful for, and it taught him that he could find joy and contentment, even under house arrest. Even dying alone far from home. He learned that if God was using him and calling him, it didn't matter about anything going on, any of the problems, even the chains, as long as God was glorified through it. His perspective went beyond the current situation. It caused him to see the good in things, and it brought joy, it brought contentment. He was thriving in prison, not just surviving, because of his perspective. And we see this time and time again in his writings. In his darkest moments, chained to the walls, thrown in a dungeon with no hope. I just want you to look at a description Paul gives about his life. And we're not just talking about the prison time, we're talking about his whole life, spreading the gospel, following Jesus. He says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He says, talking about himself, he says, "I've worked much harder. I've been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was shipwrecked, pelted with stones. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, from the city, the country, and sea, from false believers." He says, "I have labored and toiled, and I have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst, and I've gone without food. I have been cold and naked." This was the same guy who just said he can do all things. It was not a guy who had it easy. He faced constant peril and difficulty, well below our long lines at the grocery store, or how hot and itchy your face mask is. So what was his perspective? Here's what he says. In chapter 4 of that same book, he says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Again and again, he would choose to focus on what God was doing, a great work through him. Instead of sobbing in jail, he was singing and praising God. Instead of sitting there saying, "Woe is me, life isn't fair, look at all this difficulty I've had to go through, I don't deserve this." he was writing letters to us about being content in all things, to rejoice. Again, rejoice. Remember, he wrote that from prison. That refrigerator verse, I can do all things through Christ, is not something he came up with standing out on a football field ready to score a touchdown. He wrote that wondering if he was going to have any food tomorrow or if he would die alone in prison. That's perspective, and that's a choice. That was Paul is telling us, when I'm suffering and facing troubles, there's a great work. So I can focus on kind of the rundown, the broken around me, or I can gaze out on the ocean and see there's something lovely. But there's a better view. So how about us? Are we looking at this difficult season and only seeing brokenness, rundown, bad, everything's awful? No wonder we don't feel like we're thriving. Or are we, like Paul, choosing to focus on what's good? Looking at our situation, asking God, what is great that he's doing? What might you accomplish? Are you choosing to look at your life and see the good around you, to find those things we can and should be overflowing with gratitude for? Or just complaining about brokenness? Oh. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I just want to let you know that this is a tough one for me. It's not something I'm just saying because I'm a pastor and I study the Bible. I'm saying this because I am a recovering pessimist. My natural inclination is to look at the negative, to point out the problems, to think about the bad things that are going on and why everything won't work out. It's not always been an easy road for me. For much of my early life, that attitude rarely brought joy and contentment as much as depression and loneliness, dark thoughts. I would struggle to see the good, and I'd find myself wrestling with critical, ungrateful, negative attitudes. And I'm not trying to say I'm cured, but there was a point in my life when, through the help of other people and even the words of Paul, I began to realize that this was not just some genetic, oh, I was born a pessimist kind of thing. Yeah, I am a person who might reflect more and see more negative things, but that doesn't mean I have to dwell on them, let alone let them control me. Like Paul, I control what I focus on. I have the ability to decide, will I look at that or will I look at this? And I can't stop seeing brokenness, it's all around us, but I can decide whether or not I'll dwell on it. And so can you. We all can. You can stop spending your free time watching the news constantly depress and scare you. You can stop living in conspiracy theories and getting angry at people on Facebook with different opinions and just, you choose what you take in and focus on. You can choose to look at the terrible, or you can choose to look out there and see the lovely. What are you thankful for? What is good in your life? Maybe you're in a dark spot right now and it's hard to see it. Can I just remind you, if you can think of nothing else good, Jesus stood up out of the grave and walked out and said, you can follow me with eternal life. So in the words of my friend Bill Murray, you got that going for you. Here's the thing, Paul could look into the deepest, darkest pit and see light, because there is light, because God is light, and there's hope in every situation. This isn't just some, make you feel good Oprah talk here. I am a follower of the God who takes broken things and makes them beautiful, and so are you. And maybe I see brokenness around me, but I also see a God that can do anything in my life and in your life. He can work things for good. So can I focus on that or just the problems? That's a choice. What are we choosing? Because that's a perspective worth focusing on. That's a perspective that changes everything, that takes us from barely surviving and moves us to thriving. So my question for you is, are you living by the ocean and only staring at broken windows? Let's fix our eyes on Jesus and the good work he has for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. We're going to end our time with some discussion questions that I would encourage you to talk about and engage in with whoever you're watching with this today. And if you're alone, it's okay. Spend some personal time reflecting, asking yourself, what am I focusing on? What have I been turning my eyes to and letting influence how I feel? Also, just a reminder to our parents that we have some incredible kids ministry videos that you can watch with your family on our website to continue the conversation. But what I really want to challenge us with as we end, you choose what you focus on. It's your choice. And what you choose will determine how you feel and how you're doing during this season. Are we choosing to see the brokenness, the rundown, the bad, the stuck in the home? Or are we choosing to see that even in these worst things, God is doing a great thing? Have a great week, everybody.